Today I'm speaking with Jennifer Fishburne. Jennifer, thanks so much for joining me today.
Good to meet you finally, Tim.
And I just want to give everyone a brief bio for Jennifer. You have done a lot, so this isn't going to be covering anywhere near as much as what you have done. I'm going to ask you to fill us in a minute. But so I've gotten in my notes here that you went to a Christian school called Salem Academy Christian School, and then you went to the University of Maryland, and then you went to Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which I want to ask about in a second. And then you were also in the military, the U.S. Army, and you homeschooled your kids. And then you also now work in finances with insurance and retirement consulting. And you also study holistic health coaching involving nutrition as well. But before I ask my questions, could you tell us a little bit more about what I don't know? What is your life like, and what are you all about today?
Today, let's see, I live in San Antonio, Texas. I moved 45 times before I got here.
Wow.
So a lot of the different experiences I have in life, including the different churches that I went to, came from moving around so much. And that really had less to do with the military and more to do with just, we moved, that's all.
Yeah.
So I have lived all over the United States. We were in Germany for 10 years where all my kids were born. I lived in Scotland for a little while. My dad still lives there. And I've had a huge variety of jobs. I've had a huge variety of living experiences. I've met a lot of different people. I've done a lot of different things, and that's been really a defining factor in my life.
It's cool that you said you were in Germany for a while. My wife, her parents were in the Air Force and stationed in Germany for a long time, so she kind of grew up there and knows some German. It's really cool. What can you tell us before we dive into the real full story? What was the Hebrew University of Jerusalem like, and what were you focused on there?
That was so that's the University of Jerusalem in Israel, and I was studying biblical Hebrew. So okay. At one point, I wanted to write a Bible translation that would be more accurate because I had studied dozens of different Bible translations in English and found that they all had major errors. And so my goal was to do that. And so I wanted to be trained in that. And so I studied biblical Hebrew there.
That's awesome. I'll say I actually had applied to that same university and got accepted, and some things in my life just ended up having to pull out. But I'm very jealous you got to actually to go there. That's awesome. I was focused on in a similar sense, but my path was going to be for Bible translation with New Tribes Mission, and so it was the idea of why translate the Bible from English, which a lot of people are doing. With help, obviously with Greek and Hebrew experts, but why not go as an expert in the original languages and translate into a tribal language from the original if you can. So I'm really glad you got to do that. And so right now you're doing insurance and retirement consulting. That must be, I can't imagine some of the situations you see with that. And I don't want to dive on that, focus on that too much, but is it a pretty crazy time to be involved in financial consulting?
It's a good time because people are scared of what's going on. And so basically my goal is to give them peace of mind. So it's a good time. There's lots of ways that I can help people. We have literally hundreds of different ways to help people. So I treat each situation as unique,
Yeah, that's awesome. I haven't dove into the insurance part of it, but I was involved with retirement consulting a little bit. I was a stockbroker for a few years, and that was an interesting side of it, just to see more of the active traders, the people that are getting in and out of the market every 10 minutes. But that was an interesting side of the market. I know you're probably dealing with more of the people that get into the market and stay there for 5 or 10 years at a time.
Actually, we don't do the market at all. So okay. I do what's called safe money options. So after people have played with the market and they've lost a lot of money and all that kind of stuff, then they're like, well, what's going to happen to my retirement money? What if we have another 2008, 2009 crash? What if, the value of the dollar is devalued? What if the taxes go way too high? What if the interest rates go way too high? That kind of stuff. So I help with safe money options where you don't lose your money. So you can actually make a lot of money, but you can't lose any.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I'm sure people appreciate those that counsel and advice. Well, for anyone who knows, my channel, Harmonic Atheist, my goal is to focus on people's stories of when they left Christianity, and so we're going to go through some of that. But I also often bring in people that have some experience, either just in terms of their own personal research, or maybe they even write books or teach, but where they've studied the origins of Christianity and just where the Bible, Christianity came from. And so our interview is going to touch on a few of those different aspects, which I'm excited about, because I love that you've done a lot of research yourself, and appreciate that you're bringing a lot of important information to people's attention, not just your personal story. But let's start with your personal story. Could you tell us about your experience with Christianity? Did you grow up in a Christian home?
I did. I grew up in a Christian home. My dad, he was a pastor for a short period of time. He decided he wanted to get his PhD in theology. So he found the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, thought that was the best place to do that. So we moved there. And I was 4 when we moved there.
Wow.
So then my parents' marriage didn't last much longer after that. So we moved back to the States. We moved to Seattle at that time. And just a short little diversion here. My dad, after studying all the different religions in the world for his PhD, he said, well, how do I know Christianity is the one true religion? So he became, I guess, agnostic at that point. And what do you do with a PhD in theology when you're agnostic? So he went to the president of the University of Edinburgh, said, I can help you make your school as good as any Ivy League school in the States. And so he gave him that job, and that's basically what he did. And so he brought the university up, and what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, the value of the university today is what my dad did. So he did that for 45 years, as he basically ran that university and made it into one of the top schools in the world.
Oh, that's awesome.
So then we went to church twice on Sunday, Wednesdays, any other time the doors were open. Growing up, I did go to a private school for high school. So it was a Christian school. So then, of course, we had Bible classes every day, all that kind of stuff. I was in high school. I was on the Bible quiz team. So I memorized like a whole book of the Bible a year, and then would participate in competitions. And I did well on that.
So you mentioned you were a Bible quizzer. I was amazed when you said that, because that was something I did too. And it really took like the whole concept for me as a child of, hide God's word in your heart to a whole new level. Because my dad would do this thing on Saturday mornings where he would have us put verses in 3x5 cards, and we would go through, 50 to 100 of them on any given Saturday morning. And so I memorized hundreds of maybe thousands with him. And then on top of that, once Bible quizzing hits, it was like, a couple thousand more. And so by the time it was all said and done, and I was done high school, I'd memorized entire books of the Bible. And I know you said you did something similar. And it's, in terms of, obviously we look at it different now, but just in terms of being able to understand the Bible, it's like, it's been so helpful, even though I obviously wish I, had a different worldview from the start. But it's been helpful now from this perspective, because I can remember where all these things are, and I know the Bible so well. Not that I'm a scholar, but just I can interact with a lot of the subjects, and I'm sure you feel the same way. Where, as you research stuff, or maybe even like you read a different apocryphal book, or the Book of Enoch, like, oh, I can read that book and I can see where it's paralleling from the Bible, just because it pops out to you, which is really cool.
Yeah.
Do you recall when you were younger that, like, how the interaction was with your dad's agnosticism? Was he kind of
after my parents' divorce, then I didn't have any contact with my dad again until I was 18.
Okay. So the church was more through your mom taking you?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And was that just cultural Christianity, or was she a strong believer?
She was, I think she grew to be a strong believer, at the beginning. I remember in third grade, for example, and we had moved to another town. We were in Bend, Oregon by this time. And she wanted to go to this conservative Baptist church. And there weren't too many churches to choose from in town. And she wanted to go to this conservative Baptist church, but they had a really long list of rules that you had to follow in order to go to this church. You can't drink, you can't smoke, you can't play cards, you can't go to movies, you can't dance, you can't do all this stuff. And on Sundays, she would have a glass of wine with dinner. We'd go to my grandma and grandpa's. And I remember her struggling with, well, do I continue to have a glass of wine with dinner, or do I go to this church? And so finally she agreed to go to this church and give up, all of these different things. And that was really the start of her becoming very, very judgmental, very, what's the word where you didn't have a lot of rules in your life?
Pharisaical or
I can't think what the word is, but anyway,
regimented.
So her rules kind of grew and grew and grew from there, So, that was definitely one thing that impacted us a lot. It was also a church, though, where I started memorizing the verses. In order to go to church camp at summertime, I would have to learn, I think it was 600 verses, memorize 600 verses each year, and say them word perfect in order to be able to go to church camp. And so that's how we earned our way to that. And so, that was not a bad experience. That was fun. But also at that church was where we started seeing, they started showing a lot of movies about the end times. And
the rapture perspective.
Yes. And showing that the teaching that stood out to me the most at this church was that if Jesus came back and we weren't ready, that the world was going to be in total chaos, and it would be worse than hell, basically. So this was much worse teaching than the hell teaching for me, right? So it was all of the horrible things that were going to happen to us if we weren't ready. And what did it mean to not be ready? Well, first, if you didn't ask Jesus into your heart, of course. But the second thing was, even if you asked Jesus into your heart, if you had sinned between that time and the time Jesus came, and you had not apologized for that specific sin and asked for forgiveness for that specific sin, then Jesus was going to leave you here and you were going to go through hell on earth, basically. So at the end, I remember at the end of every day, racking my brain, trying to remember all the sins that I had committed. Because if Jesus came in the middle of the night and he took my family and left me, I didn't know how I was going to survive. I was 10 years old at this point. And to me, that is just, it's child abuse.
Yeah.
I look at it now, and I lived in that fear for probably, almost 20 years. I lived in abject fear that Jesus was going to come at night and I was going to be left behind, and everybody that I knew was going to be taken to heaven, and I was going to be here, and I would just be tortured. And so I had nightmares for 20 years. I had those nightmares. And
I've seen other people say something very similar. Even this morning, I was reading someone's story about that. And it's amazing how many Christians seem to ignore what you're talking about, the abusive side of this, and the fact that it scares people. And another side of it that was related was, for me, was the whole, what I would call the Frank Peretti dynamic of, there's spirits, there's demons all over. And if you don't read your Bible enough, or you don't focus on Christ enough, or you let any kind of sin in your life, you're kind of giving these demons a door in. So you've kind of got this threat of someday something bad could happen where you're not taking up the rapture, you have to face the tribulation. But in the meantime, best case scenario, there's demons that are just sitting there, and it's like they're just waiting with their little scalpels or something to come get you. And it's of course a lot more than that with a shame culture, but so many ways in which it rips you up. And a lot of videos, I remember videos at youth group where they'd show these kids, like you said, they were just left behind. Everyone, all their friends were Christians, but they weren't, and now they got to face this horrible tribulation by themselves.
Yep, A Thief in the Night. That was a really big one. I remember that we watched. Yep. And the Frank Peretti books, definitely, they impacted me later on, maybe in my 30s. They were a big part of it. But, when I had my kids later on and I was teaching them, definitely taught them from a Christian perspective, all of their growing up years. But the one thing I did not teach them was any of the Left Behind stuff.
Hmm.
It impacted me so much. I had so many nightmares from it. I thought, I don't want my kids to have that. And I never even spoke to them about it once. They didn't even know, it was a thing. So
Could I ask about that Left Behind thing for 1 second? Is it correct you worked at one point with Phil Hayes directly?
No.
Okay.
I with Conservative Women for America.
Conservative women?
Yeah. So that was a group that I belonged to. That was Beverly LaHaye's group. That it was kind of like an activist, a political activist type of a group.
Yeah.
So I didn't work directly with them. I was just part of the group.
Okay, gotcha. Did you feel, obviously looking back on it, everything looks so different, but at the time, did it feel like they were just, kind of them and the focus on the family, Jim Dobson kind of stuff, that they're just doing the best thing on the planet to kind of save this culture from the devil and from ourselves? Did you feel like that was just the best way to live your life?
Oh yeah, absolutely. At the time, that's really what I thought.
I know you mentioned too, you were involved with some different churches that had some different, some very interesting dynamics. And by the way, this would be a good place to plug. I'm going to put a link beneath our video for your video, where I think you take an hour and a half or so, where you talk through all these things that we're kind of touching when you go through them with infinite detail, which is awesome. I loved seeing that. I've watched it twice now, and I recommend people go see it if they're interested. It's a great story. So I know we're not going to do that justice, but your video does do it the justice it deserves. And I know you've got more videos coming. But in terms of just an overview of all that, what were some of the negatives that you began to see in some of the churches specifically that you went to, you took your family to, and what was that like?
So at what point am I seeing these negatives? Because while I was there, I was totally in.
Okay.
I was and
well, tell from the positive side, like what stood out to you as the positive side of it at the time?
I think that was where I made my friends.
Mm-hmm.
That was where and we went to like in Germany, for example, there was a church that we went to for 6.5 years or so. It was Assembly of God Church, completely different from the Conservative Baptist. And we had picnics and potlucks on a very, very regular basis, not every Sunday, but almost every Sunday. And because we were in Germany, on holidays, we spent the holidays together. And so they became closer to me than my family was, and so these people were my family. And we would have, retreats, church retreats together. And so it was a lot of fun and a lot of community. And so there wasn't a whole lot of judgmentalism at that church. That was the church where I learned love for the first time in my life. I did grow up in a home that just go back just briefly. I didn't have any contact with my father from age 5 to 18 at all. I didn't have any contact. My mom didn't talk to us. So I never had a conversation with my mom. So there was
about God.
No, about anything.
Okay. And she was just very, very, very private, very quiet.
Yeah. So she read us a Bible story every night. But that was it. And so I didn't have love in my life, and I didn't know what it was. Of course, at the time, I didn't know that I was missing anything, because when you're a child, all you know is what you have, right? So and so then it was very difficult as an adult trying to fit in to anything, right? And so this Assembly of God church was the first time that I learned what love was, and and I rejected it at first. I didn't like people getting close to me. I didn't like people touching me. I didn't like people talking to me in that way and trying to give me a hug and things like that. But after a while, I learned it, and so it was actually a very, very good experience. I loved most of everything that happened there. They did try to force me to speak in tongues, and and I didn't. I wasn't going to ever fake anything, and I've always been about, it's got to be real. And so I would open my mouth and wait for, some magical thing to come out of my mouth. And I did that every week for 6 years. And and it never happened. Never happened. And that's when I actually started studying the Bible. And I thought, well, let me see what the Bible really says about this. And that's when I realized, I just did a word study for tongues throughout the whole Bible. It was my very first word study. And I realized that it was just a known language that you don't know. So if I just started speaking Russian and I haven't studied Russian, that would be, speaking in tongues. That's really all that it was. And then if somebody else in the room didn't speak Russian, you'd need an interpreter. And that's really all that it was. And so it gave me the desire to start studying other things in the Bible. It's like, okay, well, if that's not really what they said it was, then what about other things? And that's when I started doing K. Arthur precepts and Beth Moore studies and Henry Blackaby studies and really, really in-depth studies that were at least an hour a day. And I would often do 2 of them at a time. So I'm studying 2 hours of very, very in-depth Bible study a day. And then I was teaching those Bible studies. So sometimes I'm teaching on Tuesday and sometimes I'm teaching on Sunday, but I was the teacher, from that point on, definitely.
But can I go back to the church for 1 second? Did they look down on you for not speaking in tongues, or were they just open to the process?
They were very, very loving. And I mean, I had many, 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 many friends there. I have nothing but good memories from that church.
Did you ever have people say something specific about you, like, I've got this vision for prophecy from God, a word from God for you specifically, or was it more generic to the church?
Yeah, they didn't do that a whole lot. Sometimes they did. I remember, for instance, this one man, and this wasn't to me directly, but this one young man, and he was around 30, and he had some kind of an accident, and he hurt his head, and he was in a coma, and he was been in a coma for about 30 days, and there would be people that would say they had a word from the Lord that he was going to recover and be fine, and then he died. And so that was, so that made me really, really question that whole thing right there. But every service that we had, people would stand up and speak in tongues, and it'd be a word from the Lord for the whole congregation, right? And then there'd be somebody who'd stand up and interpret. And that was every service. And I just thought, well, I can make that stuff up too.
Yeah.
So, but I didn't think a whole lot about that because there weren't any other choices. We were in Germany. There wasn't a lot of choices, and I loved the people so much. So, it was just like, well, that's fine. They can do that.
Yeah. I was going to go back for 1 second to something you said earlier about the whole, the context of a church being legalistic, and how
that's the word legalistic. That's
legalistic.
What I'm getting.
You get used to it. I went to Bob Jones for my freshman year of college, and it's funny. I went through a transition where, at first, I felt like it was legalistic. I felt like it was too restrictive, and it's funny. When you're in something, you're insulated, you're shielded. It's a barrage. It's all over. It's the whole brainwashing effect. Everyone's doing it. Everyone else is happy. So what's your problem? And it gets to you in a from the insider's perspective, it gets to you in a good sense. You just get used to it. And I remember distinctly by the second semester that I loved it. And it kind of scares me to think about, but I thrived at Bob Jones University my second semester of my freshman year, because it just was like, it was like all the pieces were coming together. Like, how do I live the best life for Jesus? Oh, this is it. If I do these rules, then it's just, I'm protecting myself from sin. I'm setting up good structures for, healthy relationships. and it just felt so good. And on top of that, kind of a side positive was they have this huge art gallery for Western religious art. It's second in the world, only to the Vatican and Rome. So I was able to go to this art gallery all the time, and I even worked there. I guarded Rembrandts, and it was like I loved the artwork part of it. And it's funny, I wish I could go back to some of them, because the whole astrotheology, I think, was probably woven into some of the pictures more than I knew at the time. But between the art gallery, which was such a positive experience for me, which I loved, and the legalism becoming very much acceptable, it was like I felt like I was actually not oppressed at all. I felt truly like I was thriving, which is so ironic, but I think a lot of people feel like that.
Oh yeah, definitely. I didn't feel like, well, there were times. So another church that I went to for a long time was a home church from Doug Phillips, and we met in his home. And
in the home itself. Okay.
Oh yeah. He had a big, like 6,000 square foot house, and he had an indoor pool, and we met around the pool and hoped that nobody would fall in. But anyway, when we first started, I was there, shortly after they began, it's when I started going there, and that's here in San Antonio, or just outside of San Antonio. And when we first began, it was just a nice family-friendly church, and families came together. There was no Sunday school, there was no children's church, there was no nursery or anything. All the families came and we met together, and we had about 125 people all together. So it was bigger than your traditional family church or home church.
Yeah.
And so after the sermon, then we had questions and answers. So you could ask the pastor or the speaker, whoever it was, anybody could ask questions, and that would go on for maybe an hour or so. And I loved that part of it, because you don't get that in a regular church, right? So I love that interaction. And then after that, we would have a potluck every Sunday. And so church started at 10 a.m. and it would go till 6 p.m. every Sunday. And so that was another family type atmosphere where we really became a family. So you can see the common thread here of what stands out to me. I didn't have the family atmosphere growing up, but I needed that later on, right? And I was getting that at church. And so, but as time went on, then it started with the home church started with 4 homeschool leaders. And because they were all alpha men, basically, they all had their own ideas. So one by one, the 3 of them left and started their own churches. And so then it became just Doug Phillips' church. Okay. And as each one left, they would take their perspective with them, and that would be taken away from the church. And so the church became narrower and narrower and narrower in perspective until it did become very, very legalistic. So it didn't start out that way, but it became very, very legalistic. And so then we had rules. And then, so one of the rules was that now only men could ask questions in the time after the sermon. So women couldn't talk anymore. At the beginning, women could talk, but then it became that women couldn't talk in the church at all.
Was that based on that verse that says that in Timothy? Yeah. Yeah.
So it became, much more legalistic in much different ways. So at the beginning, they didn't care if you homeschooled your kids or went to private school. We didn't have anybody who went to public school, but there were some private school families. And then along the way, it was a rule that you had to homeschool. And then at the beginning, it wasn't, there were no rules about what to wear, but then along the way, it was long dresses only. And then, certain things, you had to have some kind of sleeves. It didn't have to be long sleeves, but you couldn't be sleeveless, definitely. And
that's reflective of I think what people call the ultra-modesty movement, or how would you describe that movement?
Yeah, modesty, definitely.
Yeah. When the idea that that a lot of a woman's holiness and sanctification in a community context is to avoid being a stumbling block to men. So you don't do anything that's going to draw undue attention to yourself. And in that sense, it seemed like, and it's very similar to Bob Jones, women wear long dresses and very, modest dresses, blouses, etc., so that they don't cause a man to, look accidentally and see more than he should, so to speak. Whether it's a married man to be tempted to look away, or a young man to be tempted to just think impure thoughts. Did you, at that time, feel like that was just a really healthy perspective too? Just that, of course, we gotta be holy women. We gotta protect the men.
Yes, yeah, I really did. And what was interesting to me at that time in this church was that the young ladies were really into Jane Austen. And so they wore Jane Austen clothes. Well, Jane Austen clothes were not very modest, really. They really accentuated the breasts. And so it was, even though they were long dresses, this whole part was very, very accentuated. And it was kind of funny, when I look back at it, it's like, okay, well.
Yeah.
But when I remember years later learning what the word modest actually means, and it had nothing to do with anything sexual, but it just had to do with attracting attention to yourself. And I was thinking, okay, these girls wear Jane Austen dresses every day, and they have their hair in Jane Austen styles, and they go to the grocery store that way. They're attracting a lot of attention.
Yeah.
So it was like, okay, well, I think that we kind of took that verse and did something crazy with it. But
there was almost, I was exposed to that a little bit, not as much as some groups, but there is definitely a sense of the glorification of certain historical eras as if they were more civilized and more, I guess, protective of women's honor. And some of those ways of dressing really became just a big source, or a big point of, like, if you're really serious about this, you'll look like this. And it was interesting to see it. I don't really dive too deep into what I thought about it at the time, but I do remember that dynamic being very strong in certain groups, especially, like you said, the home church kind of groups, the homeschool groups, and a couple other related groups like that I was exposed to.
Yeah. So Doug Phillips had a business. We called it a business tree. He called it a ministry, but we called it a business because he made lots of money. And he would put together tours, and they were mostly historical tours, and
Okay.
people would come from around the world to do these tours, and they were all over, in fact, the tours were all over the world, and they were very, very good. He was very good at what he did. And it was really a lot of fun. We got to meet a lot of people, but you dressed up for the tour. So if it was a Revolutionary War tour, then you wore all Revolutionary War clothing. If it was a Civil War tour, we wore all Civil War clothing. If it was Victorian era, we wore Victorian era clothing. So we dressed up a lot.
Did you do a Titanic one at one point?
Yes.
I think I remember seeing that picture of that one. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I made my daughter Titanic clothes, and yep.
Wow. Crazy.
So.
Yeah, I remember seeing those pictures. Ironic that they would pick the Titanic. And I know we've talked about Doug Phillips a couple of times. For anyone who doesn't know, I don't know too much about him, so you add to this, but he was someone who had a ministry called Vision Forum, which I think is what you're about to describe.
Mm-hmm.
Vision Forum, and some side groups that would help, especially with homeschool educational products, but also videos and things that would help talk about young men being brave and courageous and strong and doing the hard things and so forth. And I think there was even a side branch where they got into doing like a Christian movie, how they had like Emmys?
Christian Film Festival.
Yeah, the Christian Film Festival. So if anyone doesn't know that story, that's who we're talking about. Were you involved heavily with those ministries, or were you just more in the...
Very heavily, yes.
Gotcha.
So, so Doug Phillips, he started out at HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, as an attorney there. And he decided he wanted to start his own business called Vision Forum. And it was basically designed to help homeschoolers, give them, it wasn't really curriculum. It was more just other things. So he had a lot of books of teaching character and a lot of craft ideas. He focused on very high quality, like the highest quality that you could get. And that I appreciated, that that level of, but he was always teaching on how to be a better father, how to be a better husband, a better wife, a better mother, a young child who grew up pure, and that you had to save yourself for marriage. And if you did anything wrong at all, that you'd never get married because you were impure, and nobody would want something that was broken. And so there were a lot of things that he taught on that. And so then he decided to have, so he became the de facto homeschool Christian leader. There were probably 1 million families who followed his methods of teaching. And he brought patriarchy kind of back to the forefront. He was one of the leaders of bringing patriarchy back, which was basically that the men are the leaders of the family. The man makes all the rules. The man makes all the decisions. We were not allowed, as women, we were not allowed to even to ask our husbands questions. So we could ask a question about the sermon at home, but we weren't allowed to ask our husbands questions about a home or lifestyle or anything. Some men took it so far as they chose the meals of the day. They wrote out schedules for how the family was going to homeschool, what each child was going to learn. And they would tell the wife, this is what you will do all day,
Is that how your home ever ran?
No. So for some people, the patriarchy movement helped a man to kind of step in and be a good leader. And some men took it that way. Some of them, it was very, very discouraging for the woman when the man wouldn't step in and step up and do anything. And we were told, that we were sinning if we would make decisions on our own, and yet the man wouldn't make decisions. And that's often what happened in my home. And it was very, very difficult because I felt like I'm not going to just sit here and do nothing. And he's not going to do anything. And, I'm not going to just abdicate, So I always felt like I was sitting because I was teaching my kids, and I chose what to teach them, and I chose what they were going to wear, and I chose, all the rules that they were going to live by. And he was more an absent type father.
That's got to put women in a bad spot, especially when that kind of situation you're describing, where, you feel compelled to do certain things for, just for moral teaching and for, spiritual, biblical guidance. But also just even going back to the Bible, you do have these conflicting messages where Paul says that, don't allow a woman to speak in church, let her ask her husband at home. But yet he has women deaconesses and women that are very involved in his ministry. And even in the Old Testament, you have these great examples of Deborah and Esther stepping up to the plate, and other people coming up and doing great things, saying great things, and doing amazing things. And even I remember even recently a Christian posted a meme about that lady in Judges. I forget who it is, but
Deborah?
Was that?
Oh, I was gonna say Deborah, but
the one with the stake. Yeah, where I forget the name, but it was like, I wanted a Proverbs 31, or I wanted to be a Proverbs 31 woman, but just so you know, that includes being a biblical woman in every sense, including this. I might have to drive a stake through a bad guy's head. Right. But it's like you put women in this horrible spot. And I was going to ask too, do you remember, or were you exposed at all to a group called the Institute of Basic Life Principles?
Basic Life, yeah.
Something like that?
Yeah, so that's Bill Gothard.
Yeah, I think that was, I wasn't heavily exposed to it. I was a little bit exposed, but I think that's got some similarities, right?
Yeah, so most of the people in our home church, at Doug Phillips Church, they did Bill Gothard's material, and IBLP was one of them, one of Bill Gothard's material. I grew up with that, with the IBLP, so I kind of already knew all of that kind of stuff. And I did go to Bill Gothard's conference. So he has a big conference, or he used to, I don't know if he does anymore, but he used to have a big conference that they encouraged young people to go to, definitely from 13 to 18, and that's where he would teach, make sure that you dress modestly, that you don't date, and that you have to have this umbrella covering over you. And so a young woman is never to never to do anything without her father's permission. And then she lives under her father's house until she gets married. And then she doesn't do anything without her husband's permission. So a woman never does anything on her own, basically. That was a big part of his umbrella teaching, you know. So one of the director who, I think he wrote the homeschool curriculum for Bill Gothard, which is another aspect of Bill Gothard's ministry, right? It wasn't the IBLP, but it was they're all meshed together, right? He was the director of the homeschool curriculum writing area. I can't remember what it was called. Anyway, so he had eight kids. And at one point he had an affair with his secretary. Now the secretaries that they had at Bill Gothard's place, they were all young 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds who were supposed to be learning the Bill Gothard's methods, right? And so they bring these beautiful young girls in to be secretaries to these guys who were in their 40s, 50s, 60s. And these girls, they're all modest. They're dressed in these long, beautiful dresses. And, it wasn't like they just some of them wore like a long jean skirt, but usually they wore long, beautiful dresses and they looked beautiful. And so I remember there was controversy about whether or not they could wear fingernail polish, and so some of them would, some of them wouldn't. But it was not uncommon that the men would end up having affairs with these young women. And then many stories that Bill Gothard, was inappropriate with many of the young women. I don't think that he ever had sexual intercourse, but very inappropriate with many of them. So anyway, this man, he had an affair with his secretary. And so he decided to leave his wife and 8 children for this young secretary. And so I think because she got pregnant. And so the wife and the 8 kids moved to our church. So they moved from Illinois to San Antonio to come to our church because they were absolutely devastated. So we had a huge Bill Gothard presence within our church after that, definitely.
Could I ask, I want to keep it, focused on your story, but just a quick side question. With the whole, ultra-modesty, the long dresses and so forth, it seems like kind of like what I said about Bob Jones, when you're in it, you feel like you're actually thriving. And you feel there's a sense of pride. I'm part of a community that's doing the right thing. We're obviously totally thinking about God all the time. We're trying to, take all of our actions, all of our thoughts captive for Christ. Did you ever talk to other, women or young girls throughout the years, where any of them ever seemed to question kind of the implications of, if you didn't do that, you're a bad person, you're a temptress or what have you? That, like, did people fall through the cracks ever that you saw, or did people ever, kind of quietly question? And also kind of the maybe the bigger narrative that a lot of society asks about is just this whole idea of, if you do end up getting attention to yourself, either a little bit of attention or a full-on attack or something, that it's really your fault, that you're the one that should be blamed for it. Did that kind of discussion ever come up that you recall?
We weren't really allowed to talk about those kind of things.
Okay.
If I ever brought, and I was the most vocal person in our church, all right. So if I ever brought up a concern or a question that went against anything that we were being taught, I was disciplined and shut down, and not allowed to speak to people for a period of time and things like that. So that was just not allowed. Like
a kind of shunning, almost.
Kind of, yeah.
Wow.
But at home, my own daughter, she brought it up all the time, and I wanted to have a very open atmosphere with my kids at home, and so I let my kids talk about everything, even though I did not agree at all. And so we would talk about that kind of stuff for hours and hours and hours, because she hated wearing. On one hand, she loved the Jane Austen clothes. She loved, all of the clothes that I made her for dress up things. She loved all of that. But she wanted to still be normal in other areas. And we didn't do that because it was, 24/7. We wore these long dresses. So, even our nightgowns had to match, match those, those different things. So, so I did have many, many, many long conversations with her about it, and she did not like it at all. Even though I told her the reasons and all that kind of stuff, she was never, this first thing that she changed when she left home.
I'm just curious, you mentioned the word nightgown. I'm just curious, were women still encouraged to be very, connected and fun in their, marriage life with their intimacy with their husbands? Or was there any discouragement on that? Or I would assume that with all these people having, preserving themselves for it, that at least in my experience, the message was preserve yourself for it, but once you get to it, dive in. This is God's gift for you. Enjoy it. Did it seem like that to you, or was it a different story at all?
I don't think they really talked about it. I don't
Okay.
remember it being talked about much at all.
Gotcha.
Not in the groups that I was in.
Yeah.
So.
Gotcha. The one funny example that came up recently, there's a show on Netflix now. It's called Unorthodox. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's about they're, I believe, Hasidic Jews in New York, and at one point they focus a lot on how this young girl who got married was, expected. They're pretty much expected to start having kids as soon as you can, and it was almost ridiculous how they portrayed it. Like they don't take almost any clothes off. They pull the blankets way up so you can't see each other. They're wearing the whole shawl, and it was like, being intimate with your partner with 99.9% clothed. It was pretty comical to see. But. So the one other thing I want to ask about the whole, if you've messed up, you have basically crossed bridges. You've obviously upset God. You've gone against the church community. Kind of the whole I kiss dating goodbye concept. You go to the altar, and as you're about to get married to your spouse, the other people that you've kissed or slept with, whatever, come up beside you, and it kind of ruins your wedding day. Was that pretty strong in terms of that? Like if once you've made a mistake, if anyone in the church ever does make a mistake, pretty much you're now you're the black sheep of the group. And then, like, did you ever see cases where people would kind of get restored, and was restoration full, or was it like, yeah, we restored you, but you're still kind of on the outside? Like, what was that dynamic like of the people that didn't do those rules and made sometimes maybe some really bad mistakes from the group's perspective?
So there were only two people who got caught,
Okay.
basically. I heard years later that things happened in the bathroom, because we were at church all day, 10 to 6, so things would happen in the bathrooms. But I only know of two people that got caught. And so one was a young lady who got pregnant, and so they brought her forward in front of the whole church to rebuke her and chastise her. And then they said that the devil made her do it. And I thought that was very strange, but they wouldn't name the man. And there were rumors about, who it was, that one of the church leaders.
That's like the Jesus story with the stone, or whoever cast the first stone. You're like, where's the man?
Yep. So there were rumors that it was one of the church leaders. I still don't know, who it was, but then I remember that it was a big scandal about whether or not we could have a baby shower for her because she had a baby in sin. And so she was pretty much ostracized from everything from that time. She continued coming to church with her family, I think, as long as she lived with her parents, because it was mandatory. But she was ostracized from most of the people ostracized her.
Even after she had publicly repented?
Well, yes. It was never the same. It was never the same.
That's
And
got to
then
break your heart so much to see.
yeah, yeah. Well, and at the time, I didn't know what else to think. She sinned. I didn't like the whole devil made me do it type of thing. I actually spoke out against that. I'm like, the devil didn't make her do that, But um, that's, we were so steeped in it. It was the absolute worst thing that could happen. That was the absolute worst, was that a woman has sex outside of marriage. There was nothing that could possibly be worse in that church. So she had committed basically the unforgivable sin.
Yeah, the kind of the permanent the thing that comes across so many cultures and religions is like your virginity is your primary gift, and once you lose it, you're so tattered and worthless. It's amazing what that one concept does. Your virginity is your primary source of pride. You lose it, you got nothing really to, your life's pretty much a shambles at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Could I ask, just for a second, going back to the patriarchy thing, just for anyone who doesn't know, obviously people in general in the culture talk about patriarchy, meaning that men control things and men are in such spots of authority in most churches, in most religious groups, and that's something we all see. It's obvious, but patriarchy within some of these subgroups we're talking about, it meant a little bit more. You touched on some of it, but one of the things too is the whole idea of a man conquering and a woman submitting. And I know that you've had a little bit of exposure to Doug Wilson, New St. Andrews College out in Idaho, and that concept that they instill in their students of, the man is the one with the vision. He's the one who plants. And I think Doug Phillips may have had some of this stuff too. But what is that? Did that concept, hearing that as a woman, did that feel like, yeah, I want to find a good, strong man, and this is the way God made it? Did it feel threatening at all, do you think, to some women to hear that I'm supposed to just be submissive, I'm supposed to receive, I'm supposed to follow? And especially for the women, I would think that were more headstrong, maybe naturally, did that cause a lot of rifts, or how do you remember that kind of falling as the different people that you interacted with?
So that would depend on where you were at what stage of life you were at when you heard that message, right? So if the young girls grew up with it, then they were kind of brainwashed into, well, that's just the way that it is, right?
Yeah.
And so we didn't have too much rebellion on that from the girls that kind of grew up in all of that. But it was more the people my age that, you're already in your 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever. And then all of a sudden you can have no life of your own. You have no opinions. You have no views. You have no vision. You can't do anything that you like to do. You have to give up all of your likes and all of your life now. And you just have to do whatever your husband likes to do. Whatever he wants to do. If he wants to move, you have to go and follow him. If he wants a new job, you have to support him. If he wants something for dinner that you don't like, you have to make it anyway. If he wants sex in the middle of you doing something else, you have to stop and do it. Whatever it was that he wanted, you gave up your whole life just to serve him. So that was more difficult for those of us who didn't grow up that way. Right. So that was where I think the difficulty came in. And then especially, as I was talking about before, not all the men took that message and did what they, were being told to do with it. And so then, a woman can't follow a man who's not leading. So if the man didn't lead, the woman felt twice as bad because she maybe wanted to, but couldn't. And, so it really depended on where you were when you first started hearing that message.
Yeah, it puts a lot of pressure. Yeah, it puts a lot of pressure on the men too to really step up. Like, and if you're naturally more of an introvert or you're more passive, just for whatever reason, it definitely puts that sense of shame on you. Like, shame on you for not leading your family in devotions three, 4 times a week. Shame on you for not bringing insights. Like, I remember the sense of, if you don't, it's not just about reading scripture. You need to almost like teach, almost like a little church service, like teach, your family, what does this mean? How does this apply to us? And if you're not good at that, or you just feel like you're more, more passive at it, there's a lot of shame for the men to say, you're not stepping up. And there's a lot of books that have come out. I remember books like Point Man by Steve Farrar and other similar books. I think it may have been the Steve Arterburn, their radio show, they may have done some of that. Just, men step up to the plate, be a man. And I remember several books coming out. You may remember the titles that I don't remember, but men being adventurous, like take the adventure, be a warrior for God.
Yeah, Wild at Heart.
Yes, Wild at Heart. That's the one thing. Eldridge.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it was very inspiring if you're in it. But if you didn't measure up, it just felt like, kind of like you were just you're the car in the slow lane that can't you can put it at full throttle and you can't get over 65 and people are just passing you at 90 and you're like, oh well, I give up. And it very much would. I think a lot of men did give up because they just felt like they can't measure up. So what happened? Obviously, you've talked about a lot of different dynamics of this group. What happened next in your personal story?
So politics happened next. Okay, so I was. It was the 2004 election with Bush, and who was he running against? Kerry. I think it was John Kerry.
Okay.
And Doug Phillips' father was the Howard Phillips. He had been a cabinet member in Nixon's cabinet, I believe, and he was the president of a third-party group called the Constitution Party. In that particular year, their candidate was a little more well-known than other third-party candidates. Perotka, that's what his name was. And so Doug preached a lot on why we should all vote for his father's political candidate. And so at the same time, Doug, in his ministry, Vision Forum, he had a blog, and he wrote on his blog every day. And this was, this is in 2004. So there wasn't, not a lot of blogs had comment features on them. People would just write and then you'd read it. And then that's how blogs worked, right? And so you just follow people that you just were madly in love with. And you just, oh, look, this person wrote this today. And you had no opportunity to interact, right? And so Doug was, he used to be a speechwriter for, was it Bush? For one of the presidents. I do believe it was the elder Bush that Doug Phillips was a speechwriter for. He was very, very good at public speaking and writing. And so, there was reasons why he did so well in what he did. And I do like to give credit where credit is due. So he had written this article, and he had candidate A, candidate B, candidate C. And it was supposed to be a logical article on how you choose who to vote for. And so he talked about these three candidates, and everybody knew who candidate A, B, and C was without saying the names, right? And so at the end, then he had, of course, you're going to, vote for candidate C. And then he said, if you have any feedback to this article, please write me. And he had an email address down there, and the email address was one of his interns. So it wasn't actually to him, but of course we were very close. I had his cell phone number, I had his email, I had, all that kind of stuff. And I thought, I'm not going to write to his intern, So I decided to write, and I wrote a long response, maybe 10 pages. And he was really emphasizing logic. So I wrote back from a logic perspective. And I went paragraph by paragraph by paragraph of everything that he wrote. And I showed him all of his logical fallacies because that was his perspective, right? And then at the end of my, and I did send it by email directly to him. At the end of my email, I said, written with the blessing of my husband. And because I couldn't say anything without my husband's blessing. So he got that. And I didn't want his intern to read it and for Doug to be embarrassed, because I felt that he was so far off the mark. He'd made so many logical fallacies on this. So what happened was, this was a week before the elections. So 2004. 16 years ago. And it was, we were getting ready for church. Now we had communion at the beginning of church every Sunday. And this is more of the shame and condemnation type of stuff that we would have. But so every Sunday after we would sing our 3 songs, we would have a communion message, and then we would have to ask for forgiveness for the sins that we had committed since the sermon since the service started. So from 10 to 10:40, we had to ask for forgiveness for those sins. And I'm thinking, I sang 3 songs and listened to a sermon. I didn't sin, So I wasn't sure what in the world we were doing. It always confused me because we were supposed to have confessed all of our sins before we got to church, right? And then we had to do that. And then if we had offended anybody at church, we had to get up and go to them at that point and make it right before we could have communion. So people would, get up and apologize for what they had done wrong. So Doug came to me and asked if I was going to apologize for writing that letter. And I said, no, I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't sin by writing you a letter. I said, I even had the blessing of my husband. And he says, okay, you're going to pay for this. And I didn't know what he meant at that time. So after we had 2 sermons. So the first was a communion sermon, and then we'd have a regular sermon after communion, right? So he was preaching the regular sermon that day. And what he did was he brought my letter, and he read my letter paragraph by paragraph, and he preached against me for the whole sermon.
People knew it was your letter?
I don't think anybody knew because he didn't say my name.
Okay.
I made sure that people knew.
Yeah.
I just made faces. I wasn't allowed to say a word. I couldn't respond. I couldn't do anything, but I made enough faces that people could figure it out. And people knew that I was the only person that was vocal enough to ever oppose Doug Phillips, ever, right? So somewhere along the way, in that same little time period, Doug had decided that he wanted to sleep with my daughter's best friend. And she was 15, I think at the time, maybe 16. And so based upon other things that we had, he knew that I was vocal enough that if my daughter's best friend said something to my daughter, I was going to know about it. I was going to do something about it. So he had to get me out of the way. So in January then, he excommunicated the whole family. And so at first we thought it was because of the election thing. And it was actually 10 years later that we found out that it was because of Lourdes. But anyway, so when they got up and they read the charges against us, they were very vague and very broad. And it was like, Jennifer's not a godly wife. And I'm like, okay, so what have I done wrong? If you don't tell me what I've done wrong, then I don't know how to change it and how to be better, and I tried everything I could to be the most godly wife I could possibly be, right? And he had no examples. He had nothing to say. And so I was excommunicated that day, and they excommunicated the whole family with me, basically, for that.
Which means just don't come back till we tell you to, pretty much.
Oh no, ever.
Oh, ever. Okay.
Ever. Yeah, it was permanent. And remember at the beginning when I told you that the church started with 4 different homeschool leaders, and then they split off and started their own churches. So that became a community of churches. And eventually we had 5 churches in that community. So all 5 churches were required to shun us. And by shunning, that meant that if they saw us in public, they literally folded their arms and turned around and turned their back to us, including my youngest daughter, who is severely retarded. And I remember that was probably the hardest part for me, was how they treated my kids, because she was, let's see, at that time, she would have been 11 or 12 years old. And she had the mind of a 2-year-old. And all she did was hug people. That's all she ever did, was hug people. And so we see people out in the community, at the grocery store or whatever. And she'd run up to them to give them a hug, and they would turn their back on her. That's awful. She would just cry. She had no idea, couldn't understand, why at all. But
did anyone buck the system and be friendly anyway?
Well, there
Hmm.
was at first that one of the churches did take us in, but then finally, Doug is so powerful. He's a very, very powerful man. He was able to get them to stop allowing us to go to church. And then, nope, for years and years and years, nobody would speak to us. So that was our whole life.
Yeah.
You know, that was all of our friends. My kids lost all their friends overnight because of nothing, you know, because he wanted to sleep with Natasha's best friend. And, you know, I lost my whole support system overnight. We
And
tried to go.
no sense of restoration or let's work this out.
No,
Just
I tried over and over and over again. And Mark, my ex, he tried, he wrote letters to some of the other people, and you know, we tried everything, and they just said, nope, you haven't repented. And I'm like, I don't know what to repent from because you haven't told me what I did wrong yet. I can't, you know. So, you know, it had nothing to do with it because he wanted to sleep with this girl. So, you know, they were having a relationship this whole time. That's why, you know, they weren't going to let us back in for anything. We even tried going to different churches in town. I don't know, maybe 20, maybe not quite, maybe 15. And when he found out, then he would contact them and threaten to sue them. And so the next thing we knew, we'd get a letter in the mail or a phone call saying, don't ever darken our doors again. So, you know, basically that was the end of me going to church, even though I desperately wanted to go to church at that point.
Can I ask, it sounds like it has a lot of similarities to what we all read about and hear about of cults. Did it at any point in that, like, when did it strike you that this is going way beyond a regular church? Because there are churches that do church discipline, but it's very, very different. But that's like, to me, fringe and extreme and bizarre and all that.
It was very much.
Did you feel like?
Yeah. So the day that we had that confrontation where he asked me if I was going to apologize for writing the letter, and I said no, and he said, "You're going to pay for this." I answered and I said, "I think you have now officially become a cult." And to me, that was that day, and that was 3 months before we were excommunicated. So that was, you know, when I saw them crossing lines like that, when they demanded that everybody vote for their candidate, you know, it was like.
Yeah. Could I correlate that to Christianity then? Were you questioning only, you know, one church, one narrow viewpoint, or were you actually questioning Christianity yet at that point?
Oh, no, not at all. Okay. Yeah. So no, I was 100% on board with everything that they were doing. And so that's why, you know, it was so devastating to me to be kicked out of everything that I loved, everything that I believed in. And I knew there was nothing else out there because all 5 churches in the community who believed that way were required to shun us, you know. So it was, you know, it was something that I desperately wanted. But now I look back on it, you know, it was probably one of the worst things that ever happened to us, but at the same time, it was the best thing that ever happened to us looking back, because it got me out of a cult. It got me out of, you know, that really, really religious thinking. It got me out of all of those rules and all that kind of stuff. And so I'm grateful now, but it was very, very difficult.
I love how you portray it, because my experience is very similar, where when you're in something bad, you feel like this is crazy and this is so painful. But looking back, you wonder, would I have really been shaken up enough if things had been kind of status quo? And even, I remember what you're saying reminds me of a show I watched years ago as a kid. I didn't watch it for purposes of trying to deconvert, obviously, but I remember as a young teenager, there was this video my parents had on. It's called The Silence at Bethany. And it was about a very ultra conservative Mennonite group back, you know, way back in kind of the Anna Green Gables timeframe, I think. And, you know, very, very conservative, you know, men sit on one side of the Mennonite church, women on the other. You know, if you have white walls on your tires, you have to switch them out to, you know, black tires and paint over the chrome or get the chrome removed somehow. You know, nothing flashy. And if I remember correctly, the story was about a man who came to the community who was kind of an outsider, still probably a Christian, but an outsider of sorts. And he kind of joined the community by way of marrying one of the elders' daughters, and kind of fell in line, became part of the group, and it was very, very healthy, so to speak. But eventually there was some kind of conflict, and eventually it kind of built to this boiling point. And I remember as a kid being surprised at the outcome. They kind of painted it like everyone expected this man who was the new guy to kind of eventually crumble and repent and fall in line. And it was almost like we know this is all about to be over, and we're going to have a great time, and like we're going to have this big sigh of relief. And if I remember that, it was, again, this is years ago, if I'm remembering correctly, in the movie, the man gets up and basically in church and says, "Goodbye, we're moving away, we're done." And looking back on it, things like that make you think like, wow, like there's more options than just I can bow my knee and take this oppression. I can actually choose to walk away. And that wasn't much a big part of my deconversion, but it was kind of probably a behind the scenes seed of like there are other options. And it makes you wonder, though, if you didn't ever have this situation, you wouldn't have considered the other options. So it's cool that you're kind of seeing it in the, I guess, maybe the healthiest way you can, even though it was painful at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Could I ask, I forgot to ask about one other dynamic about these kind of groups, and I wanted to touch on it before we get to your kind of your main deconversion story. Quiverfull. For anyone that doesn't know what Quiverfull is, if you haven't seen the Duggars, etc., what does Quiverfull mean, and how does that relate to these churches? And then after that, we move on back to your rest of your deconversion story.
So this book here, Quiverfull, is written by Catherine Joyce, and so she wrote about a bunch of different stories. And my story is one of the stories in this book. But Quiverfull, I just had to get the book.
Yeah, thank you for showing me.
Quiverfull just means to have a quiver full of kids. So it means to have lots of children. So people were, the definitive number is different with different people. So, some people think 6 is a quiver full of kids. Some people think 8. I actually looked up the definition, and there is no real definition. It's different with everybody. In our church, the number was 12. And if you didn't have 12 kids, then you were looked down on. You didn't meet up to the right number. We only had 3, so we didn't make it.
And the word, I'm sure you remember this verse better than I can, but there's a verse I think in Proverbs that talks about something like, "Blessed is the man that has a big family. It has this quiver full of children." Is that?
Yeah, that's where it came from. Yeah. So it's just a bag that carries arrows, and so the arrows were the children, and you send them out. You train them the right way, and then you send them out when they're ready, basically shooting the arrow.
And the idea, in a sense, is just you're kind of creating a little army for Jesus. We're Christian soldiers, but the more Christian soldiers we have, the easier it will be to impact the culture. And it seemed to me, and I might be just making this up, but it seemed like there was almost a sense of outbreed the pagans. Like, yes, if you want to take over this world for Christ, outbreed them.
Yes, that's what we were taught every week. Definitely, it was very much the message.
Do you remember ever seeing single women that just maybe would have wanted to have a family, but just it didn't work out? They didn't find the right guy, or whatever, or they were even married women that were presumably unable to have children. Did you ever see that? And were those women kind of seen as outsiders to the main group?
We didn't really have people like that in our group. They wouldn't have been made welcome.
Yeah, it would have been uncomfortable. Yeah, That's interesting. And a good example for anyone that again doesn't know any of these families. I know several myself, but if you've ever seen the Duggars on their TV show and so forth, they're I think a classic example among many. And
they came and visited our church too, because they were definitely a part of our same movement. So
okay, so you've met the Duggars. Okay, very cool. And I believe I remember one of the books I saw. Something about a love that multiplies. It's the idea that I think the other side too, I didn't mention this, but just the idea that God wants to bless you. It says in Genesis, "Be fruitful and multiply," and it's not just seen as like a build up a Christian army of little kids that love Jesus, but also just, this is the best life. A lot of these things were, from my perspective, they're like this is the best way to live. It isn't just, yes, there's a theological implication, or there's a directive here for the way we attack the culture's rejection of God, but this is the best life. The most beautiful life is a life full of children. And obviously that the hard part about it is the distortion, because children are beautiful. For example, we have 4 children. They're all young, 4 kids under age 6. I would be open to having, another 1 or 2 children if we're able to work that out. But it's like you want to take the beauty of life of children, but it's kind of taking it to an exponentially different level. It's saying, yes, this is children are beautiful things. They're beautiful creatures. They bring so much joy to your life. But when you bring this, pretend God into the situation, it becomes like if you do anything, if you use birth control, whatever, if you stop it, you're basically saying to God, it's clear that you have a plan, you have a design, and we want to follow it, not just in the sense of it's the one man with one woman for life, but in the sense of God clearly expects you to be coming together in intimacy on a regular basis, which means you're going to have kids on a regular basis. Don't stop God's design in any way. And I think, without getting, again, hopefully too sidetracked here, I would imagine there's a lot of people who felt a lot of guilt if they chose to say, you know what, I think it's time to stop. Let's use birth control, let's abstain, but whatever. And just this guilt of we chose to not follow that quiverful path. I'm just saying this more in passing, but I feel bad for the people for whom that guilt was probably heaped on pretty heavily.
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, that was taught almost every week, probably. So, if anybody chose to do that, they didn't voice it, because that would have been definitely a sin.
Yeah. And even passively, the sense of, it was linked a lot, in my experience, to abortion, in the sense that, for example, a woman on the pill is potentially thinning the lining of her uterus. Therefore, you could technically get pregnant very short term. The fertilized egg looks for a place to implant and can't implant because you have effectively changed where it would basically nest. You've made it an inhospitable place for that fertilized egg. Therefore, it kind of self-aborts, and you're basically a participant in abortion if you don't just let it happen the way God designed it. And yeah, that's I don't want to get again off track, but that's a heartbreaking another set of shame culture things to bring up people. So going back to your story, I'm good. If you want to comment, and then if you could also just bring us back to your story.
Yeah. So let's see. So after I was excommunicated, then we fought for about a year and a half, probably, to try and come back, or to try and find a church, to try and reconcile, try anything, absolutely desperate. My kids took it much harder than I did. My ex, he didn't seem to care at all. He just went to work every day, But my kids were absolutely devastated. And I taught them a lot then about forgiveness. We studied the story of Joseph over and over and over, trying to move on. And then I began to find out that Doug Phillips had done other things to other people, and he had hurt other people in other ways, and it was all very, very secret, but people started contacting me. And so I began to realize that he wasn't who he portrayed himself as being. And so the biggest thing that he portrayed himself as being is the example of how to be a godly father, how to be a godly husband, how to be a godly pastor, how to have the perfect church. And that's really what we were. We were the example of how to have the perfect church. And so, that was very much what he was teaching, all of this. And then I found out behind the scenes that he was stealing many people's businesses and selling those products in his catalog. They were actually stolen. He actually started his business by stealing the database from HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association. He stole their database, emailed everybody, and it looked like they were just getting something from HSLDA, but it was really him starting his business. And so he was able to start it up immediately. He just, had a huge amount. So that was very, very common. And then anytime that anybody so he was very active in, it was called the National Council of NCIFC, Family Integrated FIC, National Council of Family Integrated Churches. So he was like the head, I guess, president. I'm not sure. Scott Brown and Doug Phillips, I think, were president of this council. And basically, home churches would apply to join this group where they could have these family integrated churches. And so they had to basically go by Doug's rules. And that's how we ran our church. So we were the ones that everybody looked to. And so if they had somebody in another church that didn't follow the rules exactly, then Doug was the one who made the decision on how that church was to discipline this person. And so if anybody kind of disagreed with that decision, then Doug would threaten to sue them to shut them up. And because he was a lawyer, he did that pretty often. And so I found out that he was regularly stealing businesses, he was destroying families, he was destroying churches, and he was threatening to sue anybody who said anything about it. In addition to the whole allosaur thing, where he actually stole the whole dinosaur head from the allosaur dinosaur dig. That was another whole big thing. So I knew about a whole bunch of things that he had done. And I knew that he had shut everybody up, and everybody was afraid of him. And I thought, why is everybody afraid of this man? He needs to be exposed. And so I chose to go online. And this was my first time I'd ever been online, really, basically. And other than reading his blog, I chose to go online and tell my story of what he had done. And I had a couple of lawyers who were helping me so I could do everything legally, so that he couldn't sue me. So the only reason that I did that was because he was a major ministry leader. There were 1 million families following him. He was doing this across the board. It wasn't just a little, we've got a little, I'm excommunicated from this little church of 125 people. This was a big thing that affected a lot of different people. And because he had a pattern of doing this over and over and over, that I found out about. So, so I did tell my story. Eventually I had over 1 million readers on my blog in 2007. And that was supposedly the biggest story in 2007 in the Christian world, although it was still in a very small pond, And so I just started exposing everything that he did. And eventually, and it did take, 10 years for the whole thing to play out. Eventually he lost everything. He lost his business, he lost his ministry, he lost his church, he lost his family, he lost everything. And I don't feel bad because he did it to himself. It wasn't something that I did maliciously. People said that they believed me because I was so kind in the way that I told my story. He actually set up 10 websites. He had people working for him, set up 10 websites to lie about me. They were basically 10 crazy websites that just told wild and crazy things about me and my family. It was crazy. Yeah. So, but during that time when I was, I still believed everything. And then I started to question the values that we had in the patriarchy movement. No, I'm getting ahead of myself. All right. So I'm still believing everything. And there was a pastor who was commenting on my blog. And I remember it was something about slavery. And I remember saying, we're still under the law of Moses, because that's what we were taught very much in Doug's world. He taught on the Old Testament every week. We didn't teach about Jesus or anything. We just taught on the Old Testament. And so he started challenging me with questions, and he said things like, do you go out in your backyard every month when it's that time of the month? And I was like, well, who are you to talk to me that way? He's like, how much of your cumin did you tithe this month? And I'm like, what are you talking about? And I thought I knew the Bible really well. And he started asking me these questions that I couldn't answer. And he's like, did your husband trim the corners of his beard today? And I'm like, what? So it was, and I was like, okay. So he got me to the point of begging him to teach me what he was talking about. I was like, I've never heard anything like this. What are you talking about? Please, please, please teach me. And at first he would say, no, I'm not going to. And it turns out that he had written a Bible study on the law of Moses. And he'd been teaching it for 35 years. And so he finally agreed to do this Bible study with me. I was the last student before he died. And so I did this, and I think most people have something like this, where you have your first thing that is cognitive dissonance, and you realize it, and that goes, right? Your first thing that goes. After that, you start finding more and more and more and more things, and it gets a little bit easier, right? So my first thing was the law of Moses. So I studied literally 8 to 12 hours a day, every day for 90 days on the law of Moses, because I was convinced that we were under the law of Moses and that we had to live our lives that way. And I had even gotten to the point where I wanted my husband and my son to wear long robes. I wanted them to start sacrificing animals. I had gone because it was like, I'm not going to do this half-ass. I'm going to do it the real way, right? And this is what the Bible says, so we're going to do this. They didn't agree, but anyway.
I've never heard anyone say that. That is the logical conclusion, though, of a lot of these teachings, is if you're gonna do it, like, do it all the way. And I would imagine that I would hope for some people it would bring it home pretty quickly as to how bizarre it is if they actually did go through some of it, like, whoa, like, what are we into here? We're talking about sacrificing sheep, and like, how weird is this to have, blood all over it, blah, blah, blah. Like, I would imagine that if you did it, it would hopefully make it pop at you quicker as to what you're actually into.
So after 90 days of doing this 8 to 12 hours a day, it was very, very, very intense. I kind of had this gut feeling that he was right, but I wasn't going to change my mind unless I was absolutely 100% convinced. I had to be. I couldn't just go by feelings. I had to know. And even though he'd shown me this 100 times during those 90 days, I finally just realized that God gave the law of Moses to Israel. It never gave it to us. He gave it to Israel. I was never under that authority. They never had any jurisdiction over me. And so I was like, okay. So when I finally had that realization, I think it was like day 90, I was like, okay, so 2 things. How do I live my life? Because I've lived my whole life by following the law of Moses. And I don't know how to make decisions without doing that. And the first thing was, I've always worn these, for the 7 years at this point, I'd worn these long dresses because Deuteronomy 22, don't wear clothing that pertains to a man. So, all right, well, if that doesn't apply to me, then what do I wear? Right? And this was the hardest thing for me, actually. And so I remember it was probably 6 weeks or so. And I went to Sam's Club and I bought a pair of culottes. So not even like true pants, right? And I took them home and I looked at them and I thought, I can't wear them. I can't put them on because if I do, God will strike me dead. And I literally thought I would die if I put those on, even though I'd been wearing pants all that time up until the time I started going to Doug's church, right?
Right.
So I looked at them and I looked at them, and it was probably another month before I had the guts to put them on. I tried them on and immediately took them off. I mean, they weren't even on for a second because I was sure that God was going to strike me dead. And it was so much fear, right? But I didn't know how to live my life either. And so I remember Mike was the pastor who was teaching me, and he's like, put them on again. I'm like, I don't think I can. It was such a fearful time for me. And then finally, when I put them on and nothing happened, I was like, oh, and then at that point, then it was every day I had to learn how to do something new without the law of Moses, right? And so it was like, well, we made the decision that our kids can't date because of the law of Moses. And so now, do we just let them date? It was so difficult on how to live my life at that point. The other thing that happened at the same time was, okay, so if the law of Moses was only given to Israel, and so he had taught me a lot. He was a professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. All right. And so he had taught me hermeneutics. I had a private tutor for all of this. He taught me hermeneutics. He taught me biblical grammar. He taught me Greek. He taught me Hebrew. He taught me how to interpret from the original Greek and the Hebrew. He taught me logic. And so he taught me all of these different things. And so I learned tons and tons and tons during that time. And I said, okay, well, if all of this was given just to Israel, and the new covenant says it's for the house of Israel and the house of Judah, then how does it apply to me? And so that got me started. And he couldn't answer my question, by the way. He did tell me, I asked him so many questions. Now, he'd been doing this for 35 years and he'd had thousands of students. And he said, I was his most difficult student ever. And he said, I was the one who asked him questions that he actually didn't have any answers for. And he would go back to his Bible and try to come up with the answers to these questions. He's like, you're the first one to answer these questions. He predicted that I would know twice as much as what he knew within 10 years. And
ironic that he couldn't link that skepticism to a deconversion, though.
Yeah,
as a prediction of I predict you're gonna ask so many questions that this is gonna fall apart. But anyway,
no, he didn't.
That's so funny. But kudos to you for asking the questions. I mean, that's whether you stay in Christianity or not. That's half the battle, is just being willing to say, I do have the right to question the Bible. I have the right to question this God character. I have the right to question the party line. A lot of people, that's blasphemy, and it's very uncomfortable. So I commend you for doing that.
Yeah. So then the next thing was hell, and hell was very easy for me. I read one article that was the Valley of Hinnom, and the garbage dump outside of Jerusalem, and I was and I'd already learned enough about the understanding the original languages, and I was like, okay, well, none of these actually mean hell. And this one was where they dumped the kids when they sacrificed them to Moloch. And, this is also where all of the bodies were put into the fire in AD 70 outside of Jerusalem. I'm like, okay, it has nothing to do with what we've taught. So for me, hell went like that. In 1 hour, I was like, okay, I can see perfectly that hell has nothing. So that was the easy one for me.
So were you at that point kind of, at least concluding that people that didn't believe in Jesus pretty much just got annihilated or died, and that's just it? It was like
I didn't even know what to think about that, at that point.
You just knew what it wasn't. Okay.
Right. I knew that hell didn't exist. And then I just started. So that's when I started learning about audience relevance and time statements. And I really started looking at audience relevance and, who is it talking about? Because that's when I realized, okay, the law of Moses is only given to Israel. All right, I better look at all these different verses.
Do you mean that verse about if my people will pray and repent and all that, and I will heal their land? That's not for us Americans?
It's not.
Darn it.
And I used to lead the National Day of Prayer for many, 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 many years. And so that was my theme verse for a long time. So
Like in your church, you mean?
No, in my community in Germany, there was nobody that did the National Day of Prayer in Germany. So I had a whole country, the whole nation, everybody, the Americans all over Germany would come, and I had a big National Day of Prayer rally every year.
Interesting.
So
Very cool.
Yeah, I've done lots of things. So
very cool in the worst sense possible.
I remember one that was early to me that one of my Calvinist friends was telling me that we know that Calvinism is true because Jesus said, "You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you." And I said, "But who was he speaking to?" And he was speaking to his disciples. Jesus chose his disciples. He was not speaking to the rest of us. It had nothing to do with Calvinism. It had nothing to do with salvation. It had nothing to do with you're going to heaven when you die. Jesus chose a couple of disciples to go follow him. That's all it had to do with, you know? And so I started really switching my whole mindset and starting seeing every verse in this light was who's talking, who are they talking to, who's writing, who are they writing to, what's it about, what's the time frame, you know, what things are supposed to happen within this time frame. And so I really started looking at eschatology at that time. And remember, you know, for 20 years I had those horrible nightmares about being left behind, you know. And so that was when I came to see that basically everything had been fulfilled in the scriptures that was supposed to be fulfilled.
And this is what's known as full preterism, is that correct?
Full preterism, right. So as I became very active in the full preterist groups, then I noticed that most of them, well, they would talk about audience relevance and time statements. That's really what brought most people into full preterism, is those two aspects. They pick and chose the verses that they wanted to apply that audience relevance to. And then the verses that they wanted to hold on to themselves, like, for God so loved the world, you know, let's put our name in there, for God so loved Jennifer. No, it had nothing to do with that. You know, for God so loved the world of Israel is what it was talking about when we really look at it in context. That Jesus came to save only Israel in Matthew 10, I think. And so there were a whole lot of verses, well, all the verses, every verse actually, I began looking at in light of audience relevance, especially. And
so were you in the Israel only camp?
I was not.
Okay.
I was it was just a little bit different. So I met Rivers of Eden and Donald Hotchner. They were the original Israel only guys, right? And they were the ones who really, really were consistent on audience relevance and on interpreting the scriptures according to what it said without putting your presuppositional thinking into it. And that really impressed me. And so I started, you know, having conversations with them. And I quickly, because I had so many verses in my head, for me, it was just like putting on a different pair of glasses. And all of a sudden I could see all of those verses had a different meaning. It was like just flipping a switch. And it was like, okay, that didn't have anything to do with me. That one had to do with this person or this group, or, you know, so I could easily see this was Jesus and his disciples, or this was Paul, you know, talking to the men at Athens. It had nothing to do with you and me, you know, or this was Paul writing to the church at Ephesus. He wasn't writing to me. This was Paul writing to Timothy. He wasn't writing to me, you know. And so I started taking myself out of those immediately. It happened overnight for me.
The good thing about that, I see it too, is even though you're still a Christian at that point, you're going through a process where you're saying, I saw it one way, and now I see that I was wrong. And in many ways it's flipping. I now see it a completely different way. Even though you were still in Christianity at that point, that itself is a great step, just to say, I might have been really wrong before, and I see it now. I did the research, I was wrong. And so, you know, I'm going to go down this path now. That was a big divergence, even though it was still within the umbrella of Christianity. But what a great process to go through in any, you know, no matter what, just because you're opening yourself up to the idea of maybe I need to completely and even radically change my perspective. And that's where it starts, really.
Right. Well, at the same time, then I was looking at all of what I called the church words. So even church is a church word, right? Because church was not actually the word, it was just the called out ones. And so I was going back to the original and trying to find out what all of these church words were. And so I was looking at different, and I had a secret group of people that, what I call it, the round table, I think, that we had these discussions on what these words actually meant. And one of them was faith. And so as I'm looking at all of and you know, I go back to the word studies that I learned how to do with Kay Arthur. And I credit Kay Arthur actually for helping me not to be a Christian anymore. She probably wouldn't like that, but anyway. So I'm doing a word study on faith. And and she really taught me how to do it within a book of the Bible, but I started doing them for the whole Bible, and I started doing them in the original. So I'd look up the word for faith in the Hebrew, which was almost non-existent, and the word for faith in the Greek, right? And I started looking at all the context of all of them and the audience and who it was talking about, and I thought, and this is one of the very first things that happened. And I said, I said this to a friend. I said, I can't find a single verse in the Bible that says that I have to have faith in Christ. And he says, you don't. There's no verse. And it was like click to me, and between that and the hell thing, I was like, okay, I'm a Universalist overnight. It was just immediately, I thought, well, whatever happens to one of us has to happen to all of us. So I didn't go into the annihilation phase or anything like that. It was Ecclesiastes 12:7, the body goes back to the dust and the spirit goes back to God. So whatever happens to us, it happens. If Hitler, me, same thing is going to happen to us when we all die. What happens when we die? We don't know. But I do know that it's the same thing that happens to everybody, right? There's no special privileges when we die because we believe the magic right words. And so that, so I became, I stopped calling myself a Christian at that time. That was probably 2012, maybe. So I probably stopped calling myself a Christian, a long time ago.
I imagine that really shook you up.
It didn't because the law of Moses was the hard one for me. Everything else was easy. Once I got past the law of Moses, it was just like, But I had watched other people go through deconstruction. And what I had seen was that they'd go through and they'd study a couple of different areas, and then they would turn and walk away. And I thought, well, that's not honest. And so I studied every single area that I could think of, every doctrine area. And sometimes the doctrines would just disappear. Like when I studied audience relevance for Calvinism, because I was a Calvinist when I was at Doug Phillips Church, and I would study that, and I would think, okay, well, Calvin was actually right. He had the wrong people, the wrong audience, and the wrong time period. So he was actually talking about the group of people that lived from the cross to AD 70. That's all he was talking about. He got the right concepts, but the wrong group of people. So that went out the window. I didn't have to study anything else about Calvinism once I realized that he was just in the wrong time frame with the wrong group of people, right? So I started doing that with all of the different doctrines, and until I had basically done all of them, So I studied all of them to see if I was missing anything, but once I realized that I'm not in the Bible anywhere, there's nothing in the Bible about me, then it was like, okay, well, none of these doctrines apply to me anyway. And so that was kind of when I stepped away and did my video on why I left Christianity. And it was at that time I was ready to just shake the dust, walk away. I was just like, I've studied my way out of the Bible. There's a whole lot more obviously in there, but I've studied my way out of the Bible. I'm just going to walk away. But so many people saw my video and people would say, well, have you considered this and this and this and this? Well, some of them were religious. They're like, oh, you just have to have more faith in Jesus. No, you just, some of them were, have you tried Muslim? Have you tried Buddhism? I'm like, no. I'm not interested in any of that kind of stuff. But other people were showing me about how the Bible came about. And that was something that I hadn't really studied. I mean, from a church perspective I had, but not any more than that. And so I thought, well, that if the Bible's not true, I guess I should back up. I had studied Bart Ehrman's books and realized how much of the Bible were forgeries and fakes and, all that kind of stuff. And I thought, well, you know what? If the Bible is not true, or much of the Bible at this point is not true, I considered it to be historical fiction at the time that I made my video. Then why would they make up all of this stuff? The Gospels are not true. Why would they make it up? And then I was like, wait a minute, I have something new to study. So that's kind of been where I've been at since I made that video. What was that, 4 months ago? And so I've been studying now, okay, how much of the Bible is true? At this point, none. How much, where, all right. So if it's not true, why did they do it? I've kind of come to the conclusion that this is the greatest government psyop ever perpetrated against mankind. And it's been going on for 2,000 years. You know, that's like incredible.
Following in Acharya's line of thoughts a little bit, I think. What could I ask, just for kind of my understanding of how it kind of evolved? So you were kind of going through different stages of interpreting what the theology was, what the right way to see the Bible's timelines. But at some point, you're saying you switched to, you didn't even think the Bible was true, meaning its depictions of reality of God and so forth. Like, what were you at that point entertaining the idea that maybe there wasn't a God, or were you just saying, I just don't think the Bible's accurately depicting ultimate reality, but I still think there's a God, or maybe it's more of a current question, like, where are you with it at this point? Do you think that there is something? Do you think there's an afterlife? Do you think there's a God? And do you think the Bible has anything to do with it at all?
So that would be one of the subjects that I was studying as I was studying my way out of the Bible, basically, was, who or what is God? And at the same time, during this time, I had gone, I think it was 2014, I had gone to the Institute for Integrative Nutrition to get a certificate, basically, in nutrition. But they also exposed us to things that were outside of biblical things. And so some new age type things. And it was at this point that I had told myself, I guess I should back up in my story a little bit. I had told myself that what I was going to do was I was going to remove all the presuppositions from my mind. I was going to start reading the Bible as if I had never read it before, just a blank slate. That was very, very, very difficult to do because I had 50 years of programming in my mind, right? And I'm trying to just, say, if I had never read this before and I just saw it this way, but I'm also trying to do it from the Hebrew and the Greek, not from the English. So it was a very, very painstaking, long process, reading, because I'm not fluent in either one of them. So I'm reading in interlinear and trying to look up and things like that. I know enough, but not fluent. So I remember, and this is important as to who God was. This was a key moment for me. So it was 2014, I think. I had said, because I'm going through the class, and I had said, you know what, I'm just going to be open to the truth. That's all I want is the truth. That's all I've ever wanted, is to be a truth seeker, right? And so I decided to go to a New Age conference here in town. And I thought, I just want to see what it is. I'm not afraid. I used to be afraid that, the demons were going to jump on me and that kind of stuff. They were going to get a hold of me and I'd be filled with a demon and all that kind of stuff.
Like playing with a Ouija board, you're going down a dangerous path there.
And so I went for a whole day to this conference, and I saw like amazing things. And so there was this one lady who was teaching a class on how to do Chinese medicine, and she asked for volunteers. Does anybody want to volunteer? And so I was actually the first one to volunteer. I'm like, I'm really going to just put myself out there and not be afraid, right? And so she basically, she read me from a Chinese medicine perspective, and she told me things about myself that I thought nobody could have possibly known. And it was very, very fascinating. And I thought, well, there's no way she could have known that. And then the next lady to volunteer, this lady was trying to say things about herself. So the lady, what was her name? The lady was teaching. I can't remember. It was a strange name. Anyway, so the teacher lady kept talking to the other lady in the audience, and she was saying, she says, I would rather talk to you after class if you don't mind. And she's like, no, I have nothing to hide. I want to do it here. She's like, are you sure? She said, yes. And the teacher said, well, you're lying. And she said, and she started telling her things about her father. And the lady started, it was almost like you would see when a demon was leaving a person in church, right? She started screaming and yelling and getting very, very angry. And then she just started crying. And then she started breaking down and actually telling the truth about what was going on with her father. And then at the end of this little session here, maybe 30 minutes, at the end of this session, she called her father, and she hadn't spoken to him in 20 years, called her father and said she wanted to meet with him and could they talk? And this was like during the class. And he said, yes. And what I watched there was a reconciliation of a broken relationship for 20 years. And I thought, that never happens in church. I've never seen what I just saw now. I've never seen that kind of healing happen in church. And so that was very fascinating to me. So in the
and you
next,
have no reason to, you don't think it was this, like a setup by the class or anything?
oh no, oh no. And so by the next class, then the next class that the same lady taught, she was teaching us clearing, and you had a little crystal on a string, and you just hold it, and then the crystal would start moving, right? And you wouldn't move at all. And I thought, I'm gonna do this, and I'm not gonna move at all, and I'm gonna see if it goes. Well, my crystal went much farther than anybody else's crystal, and she said that I had good energy, and that's what made it go farther, and all this kind of stuff. So she wanted us to think of somebody that needed healing, right? And so at that time, I was estranged from my second husband. We were married like that long, and he was in California, I was in Texas, and he had just been injured, and pretty badly. And so I'm holding my crystal and I'm thinking about healing him. And that's all I'm thinking about. And I did not move my hand at all. And the crystal just started going wild, 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 wild. And I thought, this is crazy. This is really crazy. So I called him that night and he said, what were you doing today? And I said, why? Because I hadn't told him what was going on. And he said, my knee is healed. He couldn't walk the day before. He said, my knee is completely healed. And I'm like, no way. There's no way. And I started understanding that energy is way more than what I thought it was. And it was at that point that I started really, really studying more about energy and especially electromagnetic energy. And I was actually writing a whole book on this, and I have not finished it. But anyway, so I got to the point where I was thinking, okay, what do we know about what the Bible says about God? Now, I think that the Bible is just Israel's version of who they thought God was. Just like Greek mythology is Greece's version of who they thought God was, right? Egyptian mythology is Egypt's version of who they thought God was, all right? So that's at this point, I think the Bible is just Israel's version of who they thought God was. But it doesn't mean that they get it all wrong, right? It doesn't mean that, so let me open this up here because I did make some notes. So what I have at this point, I think that if we think of God has no beginning and no end, and energy is the only thing that can be neither created nor destroyed, to me, it was like, okay, what if God is actually energy and we have given him this name, God, or title, basically. We've given it a title, right? But we're actually just describing energy. Energy is what connects all of us. Energy is what connects creation or nature and people. It creates, the animal, connects the animals and all this kind of stuff. Energy is how this world started. No matter if it was Big Bang creation, something else, a combination, whatever. Actually, what's interesting is that there are some Big Bang theory proponents that say that the Big Bang happened in 7 sections. Those 7 sections are in the same order as the 7 days of creation. I'm not opposed to that. I do see that, there was definitely an order, and maybe they saw that same order when they told that story, which was much later than when it really happened, right? So if God is energy, or energy is really just we've given it the title of God, it to me is actually just nature. So nature, energy, all of that. It had to start with something. It just didn't it hasn't always, the earth hasn't always been here. It had to start somewhere. All right. So
Can I ask just a quick question? When you hear the way, I know this is just a movie, but the way that Star Wars talks about the Force, do you feel like there's some similarities to some of the ways that you're beginning to see the world? Like, I know that they're not making it up. They're taking the Force concept from some of the other, other worldviews and other religions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there is something. There's a vibration that we feel. You can feel a spirit, if you will. If you walk into somebody's home and the husband and wife have been fighting, and you walk in, you're going to feel that tension in the air, right? So that's the energy that is being transmitted between all of the people right there. We've got energy that's being transmitted worldwide from things that are going on worldwide, like a pandemic or economic things. When we've got wars going on, that's energy that's transmitted worldwide. So it can be small, it can be large, and it's how everything is connected. Yeah. Everything is made of energy. Atoms are made of energy. The electrons, the protons, the neutrons, they're all, those electrons are all connected and with magnetism. So the electricity, the magnetism, they're all connected, and that's what connects everything in the whole world. So I thought, okay, so scientifically, everything that connects us is energy. And I think of that verse, God is all in all, that's energy. What if I changed the word God and put energy instead of energy is all in all? It makes sense, right? So I started thinking this way. And so then I started thinking, okay, so with not thinking about any of the stories in the Bible, but just thinking about the attributes of God, do they match up? Do they match up to what I think of as energy, right? And so I just made a short list here that I thought I would go over. So these were like the most common attributes of God. Infinite, there's no beginning, no end. Energy can't be created or destroyed, it's infinite, right? Immutable, it does not change. Energy cannot change. It goes from one form to another, but it cannot change, it's always there. Self-sufficient, it has no needs. Energy has no needs. It's completely self-sufficient, right? It cannot lie. That was interesting. We think of God cannot lie. Energy cannot lie. It can't do anything contradictory to its nature. Energy physically cannot lie. If we don't put a name and a face on it, it's completely a different story anyway to me. Nothing is too difficult. All right, nothing's too difficult for energy. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. The omnis, the three omnis: omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, right? So omniscient, all-knowing. Energy is all-knowing. Everything that we know came originally from energy. Every single thing that is known came from energy, or is still, the energy doesn't leave the energy, right? Omnipotent, all-powerful. Energy is all-powerful. That's easy. Omnipresent, everywhere. That one is the one that makes the most sense, right? So we think of, how can God be everywhere at once? Well, let's put it this way. How can energy be everywhere at once? Nobody would question that, right? We know that energy is everywhere at once. All wise, and all wisdom that we have has to come from energy. It can't just appear on its own. Wisdom didn't just suddenly appear. Faithful, that could mean always true. Energy is always true. There's nothing untrue about energy. It just doesn't even compute that it could be, right? Good, just. So for just, I look at natural law. In natural law, that comes from energy. All of our natural laws come from energy, which that can be a whole nother subject. The word perfect is another church word, I call it, because it doesn't ever mean perfect, even in the Bible. It just means mature. Energy is very mature. That's the Father, that's the creator, that's everything comes from energy. Merciful, often energy does not give us what we deserve, or many people don't get what we deserve. If we look at our own lives, and we can think how many things that we've done that we deserve something bad from it, and it doesn't happen, right? So very, very merciful. Gracious, that's a common grace. The sun shines on us all, the rain comes to us all, bad things come to us all, good things come to us all. There's just common grace everywhere. Love.
Yeah. With all those things, could I ask, it sounds like you are, number one, you've given me a lot to think about, and I definitely want to think about these, and hopefully we could do a follow-up at some point. I'd love to dive into some of them even more, but in terms of Christianity purely, it sounds like you have, at this point, said that is not correct, meaning the idea that there is a God whose name is Yahweh, who has a son named Jesus, who is condemning the world to eternal punishment, but that there are some who are going to be redeemed because God chose them, but in time that equates to them placing their faith and trust in Christ as their atonement through his perfect blood sacrifice, his death and resurrection, our identification with his death and resurrection, and thereby following in his footsteps, that to you is false. Christianity is false. That is not the true reality. Is that fair to say that you have rejected that perspective?
Yes. Yeah, and that I pretty much got away from all of that in probably 2012. So I've been away from that version for a long time.
Well, I know we've gone a long time. I don't want to make this one video too long, but I do want to ask, just to try to maybe to start to wrap us up. What was it like to actually make was there a final day or a week where you said, you know what, I maybe it already kind of happened, but I'm admitting to myself, I am not a believer in any of this stuff anymore. Did it ever hit you and shock you? And was there any temptation to say, I must have been duped by the devil. I must be deceiving myself. Obviously, the fool says in his heart, there's no God. The beginning of wisdom, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Just a sense of, what have I done to myself? Not in terms of what are other people going to think, but what have I actually just done to myself? Was there like a shock value to it? And was there a fear and a fear of, was there ever a temptation to go back to it because of a sense of, you know what, as a Christian, you know that you're right. God is God, his son is Jesus, salvation is real, and heaven or hell is what's at stake. Was there that dynamic at all of, I know this is real. I don't care what I study. I know God is real. I know Jesus is real. I know the cross is real. I have to get back to that somehow. Was there any kind of that pullback for you?
Only with the very first one, the Law of Moses. Okay. That was my defining moment, and everything else, because I was such a truth seeker, everything else from there came naturally, just like, okay, yeah, they lied to me about this, they lied to me about that. And then it became, what else did they lie about? Pretty soon, it was very, very quickly that it was, what else did they lie about? And so I really wanted to know the truth. And I thought I could find the truth in the Bible, which is why I kept studying the Bible, right? And I literally studied my way out of the Bible. And then it was like, okay, so then what is the Bible? So I had studied my way out of the Bible before I even started questioning what is the Bible.
I think that's a great place for us to wrap up here in terms of that concept, because that's also what my deconversion was all about. And I've said this before in other videos, so for anyone who's watching my videos, I'm sorry for being repetitive. But I went to Bible college. I read hundreds of devotional books, of theology books, systematic theology, memorized thousands of verses. I was under great preachers, creative, quote unquote, great preachers, both physically, but also through the radio and videos. I was exposed to some awesome teachers at Lancaster Bible College in Pennsylvania, and before that at Bob Jones University. And almost without a doubt, I can say I don't recall any one of them ever telling me the truth about where this thing came from. Mm-hmm. And even just for current example, I'm going through the book of Enoch, and I know that everyone who kind of knows about it a little bit knows that it's quoted clearly in the book of Jude. It's quoted dozens of times elsewhere in the New Testament. Why don't people, and I know some of the people probably didn't know any of that. They just kind of followed the party line with their blinders on and I don't know that either. But there must have been some people who had studied this stuff, who knew that there was more to this story. who'd read Bart Ehrman or people, whatever his predecessors were, who'd done some textual criticism and had criticized the history behind this. And then when you add to it just the idea of, well, if it's not true, then how did it get created? Once you open that door, the crack, it's like, okay, there's a bunch of other options. And for me, one of the most fascinating ones is, and this will be for another time, but astrotheology, that is fascinating. And when you first look at it, you're like, I see a few things, but I'm not sure if there's that much there. When you actually have someone walk you through it step by step, and you really understand the zodiac, you really understand the solstices and the planets and the stars, and then you look at the Gospel of Mark, it makes your jaw drop. You're like, oh shoot, this is a star story. Oh my goodness, how did I miss it? But of course, you know how you missed it because no one ever showed you how to see it. But it floors me that so much of this stuff, it starts with that one question of you could say it a bunch of different ways, but like maybe there's a different way to see this. And it starts maybe with a different way to see it, but I'm still a Christian. It starts with I'm a different way to see it, but I'm now a liberal Christian. But for a lot of us, it's like once you open that door, because a lot of people, they will not open that door, not a crack. I mean, even pretending it for the sake of argument is like, I'm not doing that. You don't test God. You don't play with God. But once you open that door a little bit and say, I just wonder if there's more to this story. And you give yourself the permission, like you said earlier, to actually go to stuff, to listen to other people of differing opinions, and just say, I don't really think I'm going to believe what you believe, but I'm just open to hearing why you do believe what you believe. You open yourself up to that, and you're like, wow, there's so much that I wasn't told. And it's like the whole sheltering. I mean, you talk about sheltering on steroids there with the church, and everyone has to believe or you get kicked out and shunned. But like this whole idea of just being willing to say there's more to this story. And I know that it shook me up a lot when I first started to do that. And I've told this before, but there was one particular point in my journey that kind of switched everything. Who Ricky Gervais is?
Mm-hmm.
I loved him because of the Office, the British Office, but he was, because of my watching that show a lot, and I really liked what he did with it. He was being interviewed at one point. I just clicked on the interview to watch it, and it wasn't about atheism per se, but it was just somebody was asking him, what do you think about the Bible? And he starts out with, well, it's obviously it's obviously man-made. It's not a divine book. It's a human book. And as soon as he said it, I was like, you know what? I think I agree with him. And I cringed at myself for a second. I think I agree with you. But it kind of comes down to it, and it's saying the same thing in different ways. It's like it kind of comes down to saying, I am willing to pursue the truth no matter where it takes me. Now, if it keeps me in Christianity, like this is my circle. If truth is the same thing, then great, you're not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. But if this is Christianity and this is truth up here, then I'm going to be leaving this circle for this circle. And that is crazy talk to Christians, they're in it to win it. Like you can't pursue the truth more than Christ, because Christ is truth. But to be willing to separate yourself and separate those things, even just for sake of argument, even if just as an apologist to say, I want to be better at defending my faith. I'm going to pretend for a second that there's more to this story, even though I know there's not. You begin to investigate, and it falls apart. I mean, it falls not a little bit, it falls apart on so many levels. And I feel like I've got about another 30 questions. I literally have another 10 questions here in my notes, but I've got a lot of other questions I'd love to ask you about your journey, about where you've been with some of the theological things. But I just ask if I could maybe potentially invite you back at some point and go over some more details of this. But could I maybe just have you wrap this up by saying, what is life like now that you have, in my words, not yours, escaped Christianity, in my words, left the Bible prison? What is it like to be where you're at?
Oh goodness. Well, I do think that it is hard to. I guess I'm still at the stage of kind of figuring out how should we then live, right?
Yeah.
That's actually my that's kind of my goal right now is to not only figure it out, but to be able to teach that. I'd like to go to get my PhD in philosophy and teach that, really. I want to teach how do we live our life? How do we make decisions in life without religion? So that's kind of really where my passion is right now. So I have to do that for myself, as well as I have conversations constantly with people about, philosophical things and how, how does life, what happens when we die? What's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of life? Why are we here? That kind of stuff. I guess I still, even though I thought I would walk away, I didn't, because the whole meaning of life type of thing is still what's important to me. Truth is still important to me. I'm still looking at a lot of the various ideas on how we got the Bible. If it's not what we were always told, well, there's like 40 different versions of how we got it. And like, okay, so 40 different versions can't be right either. And
many different canons that have changed repeatedly over the years. Well, could I ask, just maybe as zooming in on one particular kind of difference, for a lot of Christians, the idea of you being able to have peace and joy, serenity, true serenity, not like forcing the issue, but just actual peace. Do you feel like you've got that? And
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
How does it compare to the kind of peace you had as a Christian?
Well, it would depend on where I was at in my walk with Christ. There were on
the good days.
Yeah, there were times that that it I would pray for it, every day. I had a very, very difficult marriage, and I would pray for peace, every single day, and didn't have it, and didn't know. And then there were other difficult things that happened as my kids got older, and I guess it was during the time where I was kind of transitioning out of the whole Christianity type of thing, where I started realizing a peace in spite of the whole world in total chaos around me, and it wasn't necessarily something from Jesus, but The Power of the Subconscious Mind. That was a book that I read that impacted me a whole lot, and just came to understand that, our mind is everything. It really is. I can choose peace or I can choose drama. I can choose war or I can choose peace. I can choose all of these things. And it's not just a surface. Oh, I'm going to choose peace today. No, it's very deep within us. So that's one book that really, really changed my life. The Power of the Subconscious Mind.
Yeah, I love that answer because it really brings in the psychological aspect of all this. And maybe we could dive into that more in a future visit, but there's so much of this is about psychology, both people's willingness to believe, if it's kind of introduced to them later in life, people's willingness to stay in it if they were introduced into it from childhood, people's willingness to look at evidence or not look at evidence, people's willingness to make sure that evidence is read a certain way versus what I would consider more of a scientific method or a rational method. There's so much psychology in this, and that's it's kind of been like a subject I've been not avoiding, but like dreading the complexity of how much that plays a part. But I think it's so much a part. It's like you can't understand. Like for a lot of people, it's like, why? Like when you step out, it's like, why did I believe that for so long and so fiercely? And like I acknowledge I needed to go through this process of studying where did the Bible come from, blah blah blah. But then when you step out of it, you're like, why did I really need that? Like, why couldn't I have seen that this is a blood magic, human sacrifice, death cult focused on scapegoating? As a Christian, there's like, that's not what it is. It's like when you step out, like, yes, it was. And it's like, why couldn't I see that? But when you're in it, you can't. You cannot see it that way. That is just, it's ridiculous to see it that way. But it's like, it feels like as I'm stepping further and further away from it, psychology is a big part of these discussions. It's not just about where did Christianity come from. It's why did we particularly, because we can reject. I mean, we could look at if I can speak, religions that say this man rode a white horse up to heaven. Oh, that's ridiculous. Oh, this person got reincarnated 30,000 times. That's ridiculous. Everybody else is ridiculous, but we're not. And it's like this is psychology of being willing to say, no, I'm just as ridiculous as the Scientologist. It takes guts to do that, but it's like it's hard. It's hard work. But anyway, I'd love to dive into some of that and some of the other many questions I have written for you. But I just wanted to end by saying thank you for being willing to be vulnerable with your story. Sorry again for a lot of the painful but even weird stuff that you faced. Appreciate that you're willing to be strong through it and not just get angry about it. You're actually trying to help people and be open to helping other people in their journey. So thank you for what you're doing, and I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Let's do it again.
All right.